Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible study for the 21st of July, 2021. My name is Pastor James Merriam, and I am one of the ministers at the United Church of Newport, and so I'd like to welcome you wherever and whenever you are joining us on NEKTV or on YouTube, or however you have found this little Bible study, to this time of reflection, this time of devotion, this time of consideration, this time of togetherness, and this time where we can really dive into scripture that we might really otherwise not get the opportunity to. And oh boy, do we have a doozy for you today. We're going to be reading again from 2 Samuel, which is really the story of King David. David in his ascent, first as a servant, and then as a leader in Israel. Of course, we are well past David's confrontation with Goliath, for which he is best known. But we are at what is perhaps David's second best known exploit. That is his interaction with the woman Bathsheba. And, well, yeah, I'll use a euphemism, but there are lots of euphemisms in this passage, and it makes it one of the most sort of compelling and sometimes bizarre and open for interpretation and difficult narratives that there is in the David story, and really kind of in the whole Old Testament. It's quite a compelling narrative. This is an instance where we are going to only read the 15 verses that are suggested in the lectionary, because there is kind of a hard turn into talking about something else. It really is the same story, and it does come off as sort of an awkward stop. I'll freely admit that. But the continuation of the story and the fulfilling of what's been foretold is also wrapped up in other things that are going on, basically. So the complete story as, well, the complete beginning, the complete sort of setup, the complete thought of David's transgression and all the great error that he commits, the great indiscretion that he commits, and the resulting really dynastic and enormous struggle. The issues that will come afterwards really all stem back to this point. We were a few chapters earlier last week talking about David sort of at his high point, David establishing Jerusalem, David bringing the ark, but keeping the ark sort of mobile, not yet building the temple last week. His closeness of his relationship with the prophet Nathaniel, how in tune he is and joyful he is about his relationship with God. But things have changed more than a little bit. This is 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 15, and this is an instance where chapter 11 does make a nice break. That the chapter before this is really again a story of military history. Difficult for us to read, not really relevant to us now, but critically important to the people who wrote this and who told this story before it was written down, about how sort of the whole Holy Land area was united under David. How really it is the struggle of large tribes go to war with smaller tribes, and then integrate one into another to create nations, and sort of get over their differences. It's not nice, but it's how the world has worked for a very long time, and how the ancient world and our holy scripture are not immune to those particular aspects, and it is wrong to ignore that they were happening, though it is also not necessarily something to be celebrated. But in the midst of war, chapter 11. And it happened at the turn of the year, at the time when the kings sally forth, that David sent out Joab and his servant with him, and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. And David was sitting in Jerusalem. And it happened at eventide that David arose from his bed and walked about on the roof of the king's house. And he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and the one he sent said, "Why, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite." And David sent messengers and fetched her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. she having just cleansed herself of her impurity, and she returned to her house. And the woman became pregnant, and sent and told David, and said, I am pregnant. And David sent to Joab, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah the Hittite to David. And Uriah came to him, and David asked how Joab fared, and how the troops fared, and how the fighting fared. And David said to Uriah, Go down to your house and bathe your feet. And Uriah went out from the king's house, and the king's provisions came out after him. And Uriah lay at the entrance to the king's home with all the servants of his master, and he went not down to his house. And they told David, saying, Uriah did not go down to his house. And David said to Uriah, Look, you have come from a journey. Why have you not gone down to your house? And Uriah said to David, The ark and Israel and Judah are sitting in huts, and my master Joab and my master's servants are encamped in the open field. And shall I then come to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? By your life, by your very life, I will not do this thing. And David said to Uriah, Stay here today as well, and tomorrow I shall send you off. And Uriah stayed in Jerusalem the day and the next, and David called him, and he ate before him and drank, and David made him drunk. And he went out in the evening to lie in the place where he lay with the servants of his master, but to his house he did not go down. And it happened in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab, and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter, saying, Put Uriah in the face of the fiercest battling, and draw back, so that he will be struck down and die. And then immediately afterwards, what has been directed happens. Uriah is killed to cover over David's indiscretion. What we have is 15 verses of David's indiscretion, David getting deeper and deeper into this cover-up of his indiscretion, and Uriah being just really being frustratingly obedient, just frustratingly and sort of unshakably obedient in sort of this very strange way. And it's left really up to a couple of different mutually viable interpretations of what is going on here. It's really narrative. It's really literary. It's a very compelling and striking and surprising story, sort of wedged in here in the midst of just lists and lists and lists of great warriors and the battles and the nations that they conquered. And there's a good reason for that, and other reasons that we read this and we focus on this and we look at this in such depth. So we have significant ambiguity about Uriah. We have a fair bit of ambiguity about Bathsheba, which is especially unusual for a woman, especially in the Old Testament. We have that even just noteworthy that Bathsheba gets a line. She actually says something that's recorded in Scripture. It is only that I am pregnant, but that's even fairly unusual as things go along. And of course, this will come to be very, very significant. This whole incident in the in what follows. But Bathsheba is named as being daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite. So that's context that's sort of lost, but that presumably would have been known at the time of just how significant a person this is. Not just significant, but part of faithful and devoted families, both by birth and by marriage, that David has never wanted for loyalty from those associated with Bathsheba. So this is perhaps to take away any thought or possibility or any notion that this is in some way an act of retaliation or an act of plunder or an act that can be, even in the ethics of their own day, in any way justified. In fact, in the ethics of their own day, it is especially unjustified. Now, also, it's strange and has been interpreted way off too far in other directions. To some extent, before we had the better idea of the sort of archaeological record that does surround and sometimes corroborate events in Scripture, the fact that he was called Uriah the Hittite was taken to make this man into a foreign mercenary of some kind. However, the fact that he's so much at the heart of, he's apparently of such significance within the army, he's so much a devoted servant of David that even if he was foreign born, he is at least very, very, very loyal, naturalized new citizen and dedicated member of the community. It's possible also that being called the Hittite was something like a nickname even, or was his in the far distant ancestry, because of course by this point the Hittites, who were the one of the greatest powers to the north of Israel, and Israel was sort of stuck in between the Hittites to the north and the Egyptians to the south. And later there would be the Assyrians and the Babylonians, but there's always one power to the north and one to the south. And to the north was always in the early period was the Hittites, but the Hittite Empire collapsed very, very suddenly and really before this point. So you have a mix of different ideas of maybe this is a person who fled seeking work, seeking service, or this person was just of Hittite ancestry, or even this person liked to do things or looked like a Hittite in some way. People get nicknames for all kinds of different reasons. But if it was how he was known, that was how he was known. But there's no question this doesn't mean foreigner. This doesn't mean foreign mercenary. This doesn't mean person of in any way questionable. And of course, Bathsheba, by her descent, is one of the people, is one of the foremost of the people, is from a prominent family, is just as beloved and in the core of the community as David is, since David's is just a good, reliable person from a good, reliable family. And so this coming along can't be justified by might makes right in any time, and has left us with just really uncomfortable ambiguities really whichever way we look at it. That of course things have begun, and probably for a long time this was a lot of stake was put in this, but it says that the scripture, this passage begins, and it is well introduced by this, and it happened at the turn of the year, at the time that kings sally forth. The implication being that it's springtime, and this is finally the winter rains have stopped enough so that military campaigns are possible. Now, for the first time, David's not going. David has become too sedentary. David is wealthy enough and powerful enough that he can send others to do his bidding. That he has had so much success. He is to some extent a victim of his own success. He is taking all of this leisure time, and he becomes bored. Send out his servants. Yes, and the military campaign is going well. All is going well. And it happened at eventide that David arose from his bed and walked about on the roof of the king's house. This is the implication being the springtime, sort of the sun is starting to go down in like the mid-afternoon, and only now has David gotten out of bed at all. David is very much taking his ease. Of course, in the ancient world and in the Near East, this has an even greater implication, because really you need to get up very early to use the cool parts of the day to do actual hard work. And so lying in, sleeping through the cool parts of the morning is especially lazy, and really is especially very much just to sleep in is to shirk all work. Is to skip all work. In fact, the only sin that's laid out against the people in Noah's time, that for which the flood was leveled against them, is that they slept in. They slept through the time of day when work is done, basically. So David is lying around. David is very much idle. David is perhaps getting is getting bored. Is just going for a little walk, since he's been in bed all day, and he sees a beautiful woman bathing on her roof. So the implication is, of course, that he's in the palace. He's much higher up in the roof than she is, and he he becomes extremely aroused about the situation. So he calls to have that woman brought to him, and we have they have sex, and she becomes pregnant. Now, of course, there's also this side note that she is completing the rite of purification. It says that she has just had her period, the ritual end of the menstrual cycle that's prescribed, which is really has only one purpose, which is to set up the context of that there's no way that this was Uriah's child with whom she had become pregnant. That was absolutely David's. No question, no possible question. So David, recognizing this, tries to cover for himself because, of course, calculations at the time are somewhat imprecise. In fact, calculations even now of when someone becomes pregnant are somewhat imprecise. So David tries to cover for himself with Uriah, and we have a maybe the biggest question in this is in this passage, without just explaining it, but the ethical ambiguity, the moral ambiguity, comes with Bathsheba coming to David. Now, of course, she would be obligated. He is the king. There is no reason, she would have no reason to believe that that was why he was calling for her. People get summoned to see the king all the time. And, of course, the king can more or less have his way with pretty much whoever he wants. But just because of the structure of society. But we get this question of whether this was a romance, whether David was smitten and this was sort of a lover's fling in a beautiful, beautiful afternoon and going into evening, just in a beautiful place when all was going so well, or whether David raped her. And to some extent, you can read this in either way, and maybe it's on purpose that you can read it either way. And people have very much read it either way. The long stretches of powerful men serving in ministry and interpreting scripture have for many, many years called this a great romantic story. The feminist interpretation of scripture that has been so enriching over the last few decades, especially to our understanding of scripture, and has really unlocked a lot that was just ignored before, has a tendency to see this more as rape, to not see consent, to not see these two as equal partners. And it's really not clear. She came to him and he lay with her, she having just cleaned herself, and she returned to her home. And then we have the complicated and still ambiguous relationship of David with Uriah. That David tries to that Uriah is important enough that it's not surprising that David would use Uriah as a messenger, that Uriah is important and successful as a warrior enough that it's not surprising that David would reward Uriah through these personal gifts, and that it's not surprising that Uriah would be rewarded in all these particular ways. And that it's not surprising, perhaps, that he's a man of such consequence that he would be tempted and encouraged by David, and David would have reason to believe that he would break sort of the camaraderie traditions of the sort of warrior upper class in the community. Notable, of course, included in that is to not have sex while they're sort of on duty, while they've been called up for a military campaign. So Uriah is called back. He's given these great responsibilities. He's rewarded in these particular ways, but he's not sort of taken off duty because he's actually not fighting directly for David. He's fighting indirectly for David, and David doesn't include to ask or to sort of demuster Uriah when he writes to Uriah's commander. So when Uriah comes back to Jerusalem, he, instead of going home, it says, lies in the king's doorway. Now, this doesn't mean that he's by himself just sleeping on a doorstep, like in the street. This means that he's joined the household guard position in front of the or in sort of the gatehouse and in the grand gateway of the palace. It's a metaphorical doorstep. It is literally guarding the entrance, but it's not just that he's sleeping in the street. It's that he's joined the household guard. And whatever comes along, whether he's given praise or given leeway or given encouragement to go home and see his wife and sleep with his wife, he doesn't do it. Now, it's really unclear as to whether Uriah learns partway along what has happened, whether Uriah ever knows anywhere along what has happened, whether he's throwing it back in David's face when he says, by your very life, I will not do this thing. And there's a bunch of interpretation in the Hebrew that you can go through, whether that's him playing an elaborate double game with David or something like that, kind of daring David to admit his transgression, or if it's that he's just that loyal that makes this all the worse, because Uriah is loyal to the point of death, even loyal to the point of death for David's transgression rather than for David's goodness. Now, I mean, that sort of loyalty, that type of abuse of loyalty has been commonplace, tragically, in the church and in wider society for a long, long, long time. And so it's difficult to read and it's difficult to interpret, especially through contemporary eyes, where we just have such a hard time seeing this. But again, the device, the David panicking, the David being such a small person that to hide his indiscretion, he would, and it's not that he has Uriah killed so that he can then take Bathsheba as his one and only, like this is a grand true love that they've always wanted, and that's what they wanted. Or even that he can go and take her. It's to cover over what has already happened, cover over something that either happened by consent or perhaps not, perhaps something that was coerced, something that was in the middle, something that's hard to interpret, and then something else that's hard to interpret follows on. Now, of course, this device has been used in many different ways. This ambiguity is very much in the forefront of literature, especially sort of in about 100 years ago in the turn of the century, and even this particular device was used by Alexander Dumas in The Man in the Iron Mask, that Louis XIV fulfills the role of King David, and it sets off all the events that are included in The Man in the Iron Mask and the uncovering of a great deception that had already happened and had gone too deep. But these fiercely and incredibly loyal men, the then four musketeers, have become are faced with like unshakable loyalty, now bringing them into conflict. It is a similar sort of situation. To some extent, we can almost look to the Man in the Iron Mask to see this from more like Uriah's perspective, or specifically Uriah's family's perspective, because there would be many who understood only some or part, those who would be maybe unsurprised, perhaps that he had, I mean, it's not necessarily surprising, though it's certainly a grounds for grief that he would have been killed in battle. To hear the circumstances under which he was killed in battle would lead to anger and to greater grief. I mean, we've seen this a bunch of different ways. I remember when I was younger, in the earliest days after September 11th, there was almost a deification, particularly of, maybe people remember the guy Pat Tillman, who was a football player who dropped his NFL contract to go back into the military, where he'd recently come out of, and he was killed in action in Afghanistan. And he was absolutely, like, he was deified. He was celebrated to this incredible extent as one who had given his life for his country, to all of this just celebration, and had been struck down by these murderous terrorists, yet again taking the best among us. And then it came out that he was killed by friendly fire. He was killed in an accident. which isn't necessarily any less, doesn't take away from his heroism, but does mean that there was a big lie about the situation, about the circumstances. And so here we have Uriah being heroically stepping up, and then it coming out little by little, and really sort of the whole thing starts to unravel. And by the time that David has gotten all of this just mess that he's created sort of back together and everything's stable again, it's many, many years later. And actually that verse, when things are finally back together after David struggles and has an internal civil war with his own son, and has finally secured like what's going to come next, and it's actually that the child he has with Bathsheba is Solomon, who succeeds him. That he, in the very first chapter of the book of Kings, which begins basically with David's death and then tells the story of Solomon and all the kings that came after him, he is old. He is lying in bed now, not out of laziness, but out of infirmity, and the king's assistants try to pep him up, try to relive the old days and bring him a beautiful virgin to lie with him, but he can't do it. He can't handle it. He's actually fallen just that far. But that by the same act of indiscretion, the same act of excess, the same abuse, even if it was a socially acceptable abuse at the time, even if it was a blessing to be so uplifted in society, but the act of abuse, the act of coercion, that he can't even do it, is to demonstrate how far he has fallen. And really, these are parallel passages. This one in the middle of 2 Samuel, that one at the very beginning of Kings, which really brings to the forefront just how prominent this is. And really, we see more about who we are in how we read this passage than who they are at the time. To think about and use this to really talk about consent, and then being the small-minded, the small, fearful person that David was, under the weight of expectation all around, to try to cover up what he had done so that he has the secret, to perhaps be uncovered, and so Uriah tormenting him because he has uncovered and he has the secret. It's torrid. It's a torrid literary device, and quite an adventure. Beautifully written, in contrast to what's around it, and worth a reread. Really, it's quite a story. So that doesn't really get any resolution, I will freely admit. But so often, especially with the great, well-known, and really compelling biblical stories, that's what ends up happening. The more you learn, the more you know. The less cut and dry, and maybe the less you feel like you understand, but the more you can draw from it, especially in times of conflict, especially in times of internal turmoil and difficulty. Know that even the great and the good have deep challenges. Now, of course, we get the story of David retold in the book of Chronicles, and this whole passage is basically gone. It portrays David too negatively. It's too difficult. It's too complicated. It doesn't work in sort of the neat cut and dried type of royal official history that is told in the Chronicles. But in Samuel, the real raw history that begins with the Song of Hannah and goes through David's struggle for his dynasty, that's real, the real stuff. That's real scripture. That's real moral conundrum, and that's the real people that we are set up as guides, not always examples, not always positive examples, but as guides. And there you have it. That was 2 Samuel chapter 11, 1 through 15. David and Bathsheba, or really David and Uriah, since Bathsheba doesn't get that much airtime, doesn't get that much story, but more than a lot in her own time. And yeah, it's complicated. God bless.